Wealth defines everything inside the walls of the Regency Club. It's not just the price of the drinks, the shine of the mahogany floors, or the way the crystal chandeliers catch the light. It's the air itself, the quiet confidence of people who have never had to ask if they belong. In this world, power flows between glasses of aged whiskey. Deals are made in low, relaxed voices, sealed with handshakes that feel effortless. But the real power of the Regency Club is not what happens inside. It's who is kept outside. The rules aren't written on any plaque, but everyone knows them. There's a code here, hidden beneath the polish and politeness. Some belong without question. Others spend a lifetime proving they deserve to sit at the same table, only to be met with another test, another doubt. Every conversation here closes a door. Behind the laughter, behind the polite smiles, the real work of exclusion takes place. Investments, invitations, opportunities, they flow like water, but only to the right kind of people. Wealth is not enough. Your name matters. Your history matters. And for some, no amount of money will ever clean the stain of being different. The air is heavy with quiet superiority. The kind you can't touch, but you feel the moment you walk in, if you're one of the few allowed through the door. Every glance is a reminder. You are only a visitor here, and visitors are never meant to stay. For the oldest members of the Regency Club, exclusivity is not a perk. It's the purpose. To them, the club isn't just a gathering place. It's a fortress protecting a fading version of the world. Legacy carries more weight than merit. Family names open doors that hard work never could. Every guest list is a curated story, told through generations of wealth passed down like inheritance. And when a new face enters, a face that doesn't fit the story, reputations shift like shadows. One wrong guess can disrupt the delicate balance, so the club has learned to tolerate diversity only as decoration. A token face here, a carefully selected name there, just enough to appear progressive, but never enough to truly change. Outside the Regency, the city moves forward. Its streets pulse with color, languages blend, and stories cross. But inside these walls, time stands still. Exclusion here is not loud. It's not the barking denial of the past. It's softer, sharper, a blade hidden in velvet. Rejection does not come through slurs. It arrives through silence, through invitations that never arrive, through rules that apply only to some, and excuses that appear only when needed. The staff are trained well, always polite, always welcoming, but only to the faces that fit the story. To everyone else, there's always some regrettable misunderstanding or unfortunate policy standing in the way. The rules shift like water, bending around privilege, hardening against outsiders. For the few minorities who gain entry, every visit is a test. Wealth may open the door, but it doesn't erase the quiet question that follows them from room to room. Do you really belong? They learn to speak carefully, dress precisely, trimming themselves down until nothing sharp or unfamiliar remains. Belonging comes at a cost, the slow erosion of identity. Even with wealth, they sit one step apart. Invited to the table, but never to lead the conversation. Accepted in theory, but watched in practice. Every interaction carries a weight, a quiet, exhausting demand to prove their worth. Not once, but every time. They smile wider. They laugh softer. They become smaller. And still, the test never ends. Because in this club, humanity is measured by pedigree, and some lineages will always count for more than others. The chandeliers cast their light evenly across the room, but somehow, for some, the light always feels colder. Malcolm Wright had built everything with his own hands. There was no family fortune, no safety net waiting when things fell apart. Every dollar, every deal, every ounce of respect had been earned, fought for. And even though his portfolio stretched across industries, from tech to real estate, Malcolm never wore his wealth like armor. He believed success didn't need to scream. On this day, his suit was sharp but simple, tailored to fit but not to impress. The cloth whispered confidence, not desperation. His shoes carried the shine of a man who respected hard work, not a man begging to be recognized. Because Malcolm had learned long ago, no matter how well he dressed, Some people would only ever see his skin. The front doors of the Regency Club stood tall before him. To anyone else, it was just a door. To Malcolm, it was history itself, a symbol wrapped in wood and glass. Not just a doorway, but a line between wealth and worth, between invitation and exclusion, between belonging and being reminded you never truly will. He adjusted his cufflinks once, breathed in slowly, and stepped forward. The moment Malcolm crossed the threshold, the weight of his presence filled the room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every footstep stirred unspoken questions. Every glance from the staff carried hesitation, the silent language of assumptions unfolding before him. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a perfectly polite smile, greeted him with professional calm. But Malcolm saw it, that flicker, that split second where his skin spoke louder than his name. Wealth was assumed for some men the moment they walked through these doors. For Malcolm, it would always be a question. "Good afternoon," Malcolm said, voice measured, calm. "I'm here to inquire about membership." The receptionist blinked, smile faltering for just a moment. Malcolm's tone was too confident to dismiss, but his face didn't fit the picture these halls expected. "Of course," the receptionist said, flipping open a leather-bound registry. "And your name?" "Malcolm Wright." The pen in the receptionist's hand hesitated, just briefly, before the name was scribbled down. There was no mistaking it. Malcolm Wright, the investor, the philanthropist, the man whose deals made headlines. They knew the name. They just didn't expect him. The receptionist's smile stretched tighter, polite, but no longer natural. The kind of smile used when someone important turns out to be the wrong kind of important. Malcolm could feel the ripple traveling across the room. Club members glanced up from their drinks, from their quiet conversations, taking silent note of the man who wasn't supposed to be there. A black man with wealth wasn't part of the Regency Club's script. His success disrupted the story they told themselves about who belonged at the table. Malcolm stood still, shoulders back, expression calm, but inside he felt it, that silent vote being cast, the judgment rolling through the air like static. The receptionist's voice softened, carefully measured now. "Membership here is highly selective. There's a process." "I understand," Malcolm replied. "I'm happy to go through the process." The receptionist hesitated again, fingers twitching on the edge of the desk. There was no rule against it, no official reason to say no. But the unspoken rule, the one built into the foundation of this place, had already whispered its answer. "We'll be in touch, the receptionist said, voice slipping into the carefully rehearsed politeness that always accompanied quiet rejection. Malcolm knew this tone. He'd met it in boardrooms, at investor pitches, at luxury car dealerships and country clubs. It was the voice of exclusion wrapped in a handshake. He had faced it at 19, when his first business loan was denied without explanation. At 25, when investors smiled but passed, telling him his vision lacked stability. And now here he was again, wealthy, successful, a self-made man at the height of his career, still forced to prove that he was enough. But Malcolm didn't show his frustration, not here, not today. Because every step forward was about more than Malcolm Wright. It was about every young black entrepreneur who would follow. Every door that opened, every seat at the table, every inch of respect had to be paid for. Twice. He left his name in the registry, turned without argument, and walked toward the door. Wealth had opened the door a crack, but skin had pushed it shut. And Malcolm knew, if they wouldn't let him in, he'd find another way. Because in the world Malcolm Wright came from, the lesson was clear. If they don't let you sit at their table, you build your own. Elliot Moore had worked the front desk of the Regency Club for nearly 20 years. His smile was polished, his tone precise. He knew how to make people feel welcome, and just as easily, how to make them feel they didn't belong. When Malcolm Wright approached the desk, Elliot's smile appeared on cue. Polite, professional, but his eyes gave him away. There was a flicker, a quick involuntary scan from Malcolm's shoes to his face. Like Elliot was searching for a reason, any reason, to believe Malcolm had walked into the wrong place. It was a glance Malcolm knew too well. The glance that decided worth before a word was spoken. Elliot's smile didn't falter, but something about it felt thinner now, stretched over a quiet discomfort. "Good afternoon," Elliot said, his voice dripping with forced warmth. "How can I help you today?" Malcolm's voice was calm, steady. "I'm here to apply for membership." There it was, the first crack in Elliot's composure. His eyebrows lifted just a little too high. His fingers hovered over the registry book like the request itself had thrown him off balance. "Ah," Elliot said, recovering quickly. "Well, you see, this is a private establishment. Membership is by invitation only." The words rolled off his tongue like a script. The kind of script meant for people like Malcolm. Polite enough to avoid trouble, firm enough to make the message clear. Malcolm didn't blink. "I understand," he said, "but I'd still like to apply." Elliot's smile sharpened at the edges, the way a blade sharpens when drawn from its sheath. "It's a very selective process," he said. "I'm not sure it would be a good fit." A good fit. Malcolm had heard those words before. In luxury stores, in corporate offices, in boardrooms where deals went cold the moment he walked in. They never said race out loud, but they didn't have to. The meaning fit neatly between the words. Still, Malcolm didn't flinch. "I'd still like the application," he repeated. Elliot's smile stretched wider, though his eyes held no humor. This was a performance now, a ritual he knew how to play. "Of course," Elliot said. "I'll just need to check with the manager." He didn't move. He didn't reach for the paperwork. Instead, he let silence settle between them, expecting Malcolm to shrink under the weight of it, to realize, like so many others had, that this was the part where he was supposed to quietly step aside. But Malcolm didn't move either. The air between them thickened, filling with all the history that had led to this moment. Malcolm wasn't just standing there for himself. He stood for every man who had been turned away without explanation, for every woman who had dressed twice as sharp, spoken twice as carefully, and still been told, "We're not hiring," for every entrepreneur whose business plan was perfect until the wrong name appeared on the cover page. Elliot's smile wavered. "One moment," he said at last, his voice a touch colder now. With a sigh heavy with annoyance, Elliot waved across the room, signaling for someone higher up. Another employee arrived, shoulders already tense, sensing the shift in the air. "This gentleman is interested in membership," Elliot said, the word gentleman carrying a weight of disbelief. The second employee took one look at Malcolm, then back at Elliot, and something silent passed between them, a shared understanding that this was about to become a problem. "I'm afraid we'll have to ask you to leave," the employee said, voice smooth and practiced, as though they had rehearsed this moment many times before. "Membership is closed at the moment." Malcolm said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood a little straighter. "I'd like to speak with the general manager," he said, his tone calm but firm. The request landed like a challenge. Elliot's smile vanished entirely now, replaced with thinly veiled irritation. "Sir, that really won't be necessary." "It is necessary," Malcolm said. "I'd like to speak with whoever's in charge." Elliot let out a long breath, the kind people release when they've lost patience with someone who doesn't know their place. "One moment," he muttered, his voice stripped of warmth. Another call was made, and within minutes, security appeared. Not in a rush, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of men whose job was to remove problems without making a scene. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just a calm, quiet removal, clean, efficient, the way exclusion was designed to work in places like this. Malcolm walked out on his own, back straight, shoulders squared, his silence carrying more dignity than any argument ever could. And behind him, Elliot returned to the desk, his smile back in place for the next guest who looked the part. But what Elliot didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Malcolm Wright never forgot a face. And before this story was over, every polite smile, every quiet dismissal, every not a good fit would come back to haunt them all. Because Malcolm had learned a long time ago, if the system doesn't see your worth, you don't ask for a seat. You take the whole table. Malcolm Wright didn't need anyone to tell him what was happening. The moment the second staff member appeared and walked him toward the door, the message was loud and clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reminder. Every step toward the exit felt heavier than the last, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of history. The club members who had barely noticed him when he walked in now watched his departure with amused curiosity. Some of them smiled, others whispered, and a few, like Walter Kensington, didn't bother to hide their satisfaction. "Well, look at that!" Walter's voice rang out across the room, loud enough to make sure everyone heard. "What did you think this was? A chain restaurant you could just stroll into?" Laughter bubbled around the room, sharp and cruel. Malcolm's back stiffened, but he kept walking. Walter wasn't finished. "Next time, check the dress code," he sneered, "and maybe the guest list." More laughter. Malcolm said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. He knew better than to give men like Walter what they wanted. They wanted anger. They wanted a scene. They wanted proof that men like Malcolm didn't belong because they couldn't play the game. But Malcolm had spent a lifetime playing the game, even when the rules were stacked against him. Behind him, Elliot's smile had returned, stretched across his face like a mask. "I hope you understand, sir," Elliot said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It's just club policy." Malcolm met his eyes for a brief moment, long enough for Elliot to know that Malcolm understood exactly what had happened here. Then Malcolm stepped outside. The door closed behind him, sealing in the laughter, the whispers, the quiet violence of polite exclusion. Malcolm stood still, breathing in the cool air, trying to calm the storm building inside him. He had faced this kind of humiliation before, but no matter how many times it happened, it still left a scar. He walked to his car, his movements slow and measured, but his hands shook the moment he gripped the steering wheel. His knuckles whitened as memories came flooding back. The first bank loan denied when his business was still an idea. The first time a potential partner assumed he was the assistant, not the CEO. The first handshake that didn't happen because someone's hand just couldn't quite reach across the divide. Even now, after everything he'd built, after proving himself 100 times over, it was still never enough. Because to men like Elliot and Walter, wealth wasn't the ticket, skin was. And Malcolm's skin told a story they would never allow into their version of success. He stared through the windshield, breathing slow and deep, until the anger settled into something colder, sharper. This was the kind of moment that could break a man. But Malcolm had been broken before, and every time he put himself back together stronger than before. He knew the script they expected him to follow. Drive away, swallow the insult, let the moment pass. But Malcolm had never been good at following scripts written by other people. His hand reached for his phone, not to vent, not to complain, to act. He scrolled to the number without hesitation. Richard Lawson, friend, business partner, and the one man who knew exactly what this fight felt like. The call barely rang once before Richard answered. "Malcolm? What's up?" Malcolm's voice was calm, deadly calm. "Find out who owns the Regency Club." There was a pause on the other end. "Why? What happened?" "Just find out," Malcolm said. "I want it." Richard exhaled sharply. "The whole thing?" "The whole thing," Malcolm said. "Down to the carpets." There was another pause, a hesitation Malcolm expected, but only for a second. "All right," Richard said, his voice shifting from surprise to steel. "I'm on it." The call ended, but Malcolm's mind was already 10 steps ahead. The Regency Club had spent decades deciding who was worthy. Now Malcolm Wright would decide if the Regency Club was worthy of surviving. And the men who had laughed as he walked out were about to learn something they had never been taught. When you build a door to keep a man out, you better pray he never learns how to buy the whole damn building. Malcolm Wright wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge was too small, too temporary. What Malcolm wanted was something bigger, a reckoning written in ink. The night after he was escorted out of the Regency Club, Malcolm's team got to work. They didn't just pull financial records or market analysis. They dug deeper. They uncovered cracks no one had noticed before. Years of declining membership, outdated policies that no longer fit the city's changing face, and whispers of an owner who was quietly, desperately, looking for a way out. That owner was Charles Langston. Once a king in real estate, Langston had built half the skyline Malcolm used to dream about as a child. But the world had moved on, and Langston's grip had started to slip. His legacy, much like the Regency Club itself, was built on rules written for a time that no longer existed. For men like Langston, tradition was wealth. But for Malcolm, wealth had always been survival. And survival taught Malcolm one thing: everything is for sale if you know where to look. It took less than 48 hours to arrange a meeting. When Malcolm walked into Charles Langston's office, there was no hesitation, no second glance at his skin, no questioning whether he belonged. Because in this room, money spoke louder than anything else. Langston leaned back in his leather chair, eyes scanning the portfolio Malcolm's team had sent ahead. Numbers didn't have a race. Balance sheets didn't carry prejudice. And Langston's failing club needed exactly what Malcolm offered: money and new blood. "The Regency still has potential," Langston said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But it's been losing relevance." Malcolm didn't smile. Not fully. Just enough to let Langston believe they were talking about business, not justice. "I think I can breathe some new life into it." Langston's gaze lingered for a moment, as if a small part of him understood there was something more beneath Malcolm's calm demeanor. But the offer was too good to refuse. Pride might have kept some men from selling a club like the Regency to someone like Malcolm, but Langston's pride had a price tag. By the time the meeting ended, Malcolm didn't just have a seat at the table, he owned the table. The paperwork moved fast, faster than anyone expected. Because for all its history, for all its exclusivity, the Regency Club was still a business. And when money talks, even the oldest walls come down. With every document Malcolm signed, he thought of Elliot's polite smile, Walter's laughter, every whispered conversation that ended the moment he walked by, every quiet rejection that had shaped his life. 2 days later, it was done. Malcolm Wright was the sole owner of the Regency Club. He didn't hold a press conference. There were no cameras or speeches, because this wasn't about applause. This was about correction. The same door that had closed in his face now opened with his name engraved at the top. And for the first time in its history, the Regency Club belonged to a man it had spent decades trying to keep out. Malcolm didn't buy the club for its name or its prestige. He bought it to rewrite what power looked like, to turn every whispered doubt, every condescending smile, every moment of exclusion into a story that couldn't be erased. He sat alone in his office that night, the papers signed, the deal sealed, the weight of ownership heavy in his hands. This wasn't just property, it was history, a history that, from this moment forward, would no longer belong to men like Elliot and Walter. It belonged to Malcolm Wright and to every person who had ever been told they weren't a good fit. The next morning, the members of the Regency Club received an email, brief, direct, and unfamiliar. Mandatory emergency meeting. Boardroom. 9 a.m. Attendance required. There was no reason given, no explanation attached, just a time and a demand. By 8:55, the room filled with low murmurs and impatient sighs. Elliot sat near the head of the table, posture stiff, his smile stretched tight as he whispered with Walter Kensington, who lounged back in his chair, lazily confident that this was just another financial update. "Probably some nonsense about membership fees," Walter muttered. "Nothing to worry about." But there was something different in the air, something that made even the most privileged men sit a little straighter. The air inside the boardroom felt heavier than usual, like something unspoken had been invited to the table. The general manager entered, hands trembling slightly as he placed a stack of papers in front of him. His voice wavered as he began to speak. "Effective immediately," the manager said, pausing to clear his throat. "The Regency Club has a new owner." The room went silent. Before anyone could ask a question, the door opened. Malcolm Wright stepped inside. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence did that for him. Dressed in a tailored suit that carried quiet authority, Malcolm walked the length of the room, his footsteps landing like thunder in the silence. Elliot's face drained of color. Walter's smirk shattered on impact. The man they had dismissed, mocked, and walked out the door, now stood at the head of the table, not as a guest begging for acceptance, but as the one who decided who stayed and who left. Malcolm pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the same seat where decisions had been made about who belonged, who mattered, and who never would. He sat down, calm and unshaken, and let the silence do its work. Then he spoke. "The Regency Club has a long history," Malcolm began. "A history built on exclusivity, on unspoken rules about who fits and who never will." His voice was steady, not angry, not bitter, just true. "For years, this place has stood as a symbol, not of success, but of separation. A club where wealth was only welcome if it came wrapped in the right skin." He looked directly at Elliot, who couldn't meet his gaze, then at Walter, whose face was already red with the first signs of humiliation. "That ends today." Malcolm unfolded a document and slid it across the table. "Effective immediately, the Regency Club will operate under a new standard. Membership based on character, merit, and vision. Not bloodlines, not skin color, not old money and ancient bias." Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but his voice faltered. "Mr. Wright, I was only following long-standing policy. There was, there was never any intention to—" Malcolm cut him off with a single sentence. "Your services are no longer required." The words landed with a finality that left no room for argument. Two security guards stepped inside, the same ones who had once quietly escorted Malcolm out. Only this time, their hands were ready for Elliot. Elliot's face crumbled under the weight of consequence, and within moments he was gone, carried out like so many others he had politely pushed aside. Malcolm's gaze shifted to Walter, who sat up straighter, still clinging to the arrogance privilege had gifted him. "This is ridiculous," Walter barked. "You think you can just come in here and tear apart generations of tradition? Do you even know what this place stands for?" Malcolm stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks with the same care and calm he had carried through the entire meeting. "Yes," Malcolm said quietly. "I know exactly what this place stands for." Walter sneered. "You listen to me, Wright." Malcolm's eyes locked onto his. "That's Mr. Wright to you." Walter's face twisted with 1,000 unspoken protests, but for the first time, he had no ground to stand on. The club, the rules, the power, all of it belonged to Malcolm now, and there was nothing privilege could do to save him. Walter stood abruptly, knocking over his chair, and stormed out, stripped of the one thing wealth had always bought him: control. As the door swung shut, Malcolm remained standing at the head of the table, scanning the faces of the remaining members. Some were angry, some embarrassed, and a few, the ones who knew this change was overdue, nodded quietly in understanding. "This club will still be a symbol," Malcolm said, "but from today forward, it will stand for something better." He took a breath steady and full, and in that moment, Malcolm Wright wasn't just a man who had bought a club. He was a man who had rewritten the rules. The Regency Club looked different now, not just in design, but in spirit. Walls that once whispered exclusion now carried voices from every corner of the city. The heavy air of superiority had lifted, replaced by something lighter: possibility. The renovations had been swift and intentional, but the real change couldn't be seen in the furniture or the decor. It lived in the new membership list. Leaders, innovators, and dreamers, handpicked not for their last names or family wealth, but for their vision, their work, their courage. There were no secret bloodline requirements, no hushed conversations about someone being the right fit. Now the only thing that mattered was what you stood for. For the first time, the club wasn't a gate, it was a bridge. The old silence had been replaced with something beautiful. Laughter rang from the lounge. Spirited debates filled the halls. Conversations that once would have been hushed were now encouraged. Ideas flowing between people who, in another time, never would have sat at the same table. The Regency Club was no longer a relic. It was alive, pulsing with energy from every walk of life. Its success had no single face, no single story, and that was its greatest strength. One evening, just as the sun dipped low, a familiar figure appeared at the entrance. Walter Kensington stood outside, his polished shoes planted firmly on the marble steps, his face set in stone. He had returned, expecting the door to open the way it always had, for a man like him. But when he approached the desk, the receptionist barely glanced up. The smile was polite, but cold, the same smile Malcolm had once been greeted with. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity tonight," the receptionist said, voice smooth and unbothered. Walter's brows knit together. I've been a member here for 30 years. The receptionist's smile didn't budge. We've updated our membership policies. Walter's fist clenched at his sides. His money couldn't save him this time. His last name meant nothing here now. For the first time, Walter Kensington stood outside the doors of the world he used to control, and there was no one left to intimidate. He turned sharply, shoulders stiff, walking back down the steps. This time, the door had closed on him. Inside the club, Malcolm sat at the bar, the very bar that once felt like a dividing line, a place where men like him stood at the edges, tolerated but never embraced. Now it was his seat. He sipped his drink slowly, watching the transformation unfold before his eyes. At every table, there was life. Young entrepreneurs, immigrant founders, women who had been overlooked for years, all talking, laughing, creating a future no one could have imagined in this room before. Richard slid onto the stool beside him, shaking his head with a grin. Man, Richard said, if I didn't see it myself, I wouldn't believe it. Malcolm chuckled softly. Feels good, he said, but it was never about feeling good. Richard raised an eyebrow. So what was it about? Malcolm set his glass down, the weight of it settling into the polished wood. It was about change, Malcolm said. Real change. Not a seat at their table. A whole new table. He lifted his glass slightly. To real success. Richard tapped his glass against Malcolm's. To the fight. They drank, not to revenge, but to justice done right, to the quiet satisfaction of rewriting a story that was never meant to include them. Malcolm didn't just buy the Regency Club. He dismantled the very foundation it stood on and built something stronger in its place. He didn't just break the system, he made sure that for everyone who came after him, the doors would never close again.